My name is Wolfgang Thum. I'm a forestry master at the Bavarian State Forest at the Forest Education Center in Laubau. And today, I'm going to explain how to best sharpen a dull chain. For that, I've brought along a cutting tooth. In this case, this is a so-called full chisel tooth. It has a right-angled edge, and if you look at it from above, from the top plate, you can see that there is a sharp point between the top plate and the side plate cutting edges. As an effect, the tooth cuts rather aggressively and very well. But if it has been slightly damaged by a stone or dirt, then the tooth becomes blunt. On the other hand, when you look at a semi-chisel tooth, you'll see that it's slightly rounded and it doesn't have a sharp point. It's not as aggressive, it doesn't cut as well, but it makes softer cuts and stays sharp for longer. If you look at the tooth from the side, you see that the tooth tapers towards the back. It becomes shorter towards the back. That affects us in two ways. Firstly, if the chain is new, then you'll need a larger file, up to about half the length of the tooth. When the tooth becomes smaller, you'll have to use a smaller file. And with the depth gauge, the more you file down the cutting tooth, the lower it will become, and in contrast, the higher the raker will become. This means that this depth gauge, which is responsible for the thickness of the wood chipping, must also be filed down, otherwise the whole thing won't work. If I want to fix the cutting tooth, I have to be careful with some of the angles. The first one is the so-called sharpening angle on the top plate. With my file, I can either make it sharper or blunter. And the second one is the side plate angle. When you hold the file to the tooth, it should point slightly forwards. If you look at that sharpening angle, you'll notice that the full chisel tooth is generally blunter. So it's a little further forward, as it's already rather aggressive. Here, you'll have to look at the packaging to see what the manufacturer says about how sharp the angle needs to be. Usually, it should be between 25 and 30 degrees. And for the semi-chisel tooth, it should be a bit more pointed, between 30 and 35 degrees. The same goes for the side plate cutting edge angle. Here, again, you'll have to see what the manufacturer specifies, but as I said, the file should point slightly forward, between 60 and 85 degrees. Now, looking at the depth gauge, which determines the thickness of the wood chip, in this case, it depends on whether I use a small, a medium-sized, or a large chainsaw, and on whether I cut softwood or hardwood. The distance between the raker's surface and the top plate should be 0.65 to 0.8 millimeters accordingly. If I want to fix my cutting teeth, I'll need the right tools. I brought some along, namely various round files. Depending on the chain size, there are different file sizes, ranging from 5.5 to 4.5 millimeters. Here I have a so-called file angle plate, which will help me maintain my sharpening angle. Here you can see it says 25 degrees. The different angles are indicated on the file angle plate. In order to lower the raker to the required height, I need a flat file and a depth gauge. I need a caliper gauge to determine the length of the tooth. And I will use a marker to mark the shortest tooth, the so-called leading cutter. The chainsaw has to be fixed into position. I prefer it to be at elbow height, as then you can stand up straight and work better. Looking at my chainsaw guide bar, I see that there are left and right-angled cutting teeth. I always file the tooth that is on the opposite side. But I still have to know which file size I need. For that, I just need to look at my guide bar. Here it says 0.325 inch. That means that the distance between one rivet to the next is 0.325 inches, which is 8.3 millimeters. With a 0.325 chain, I'd start by using a 4.8 millimeter file for a new chain. and finish with a 4.5mm file. Yeah, I'll check my file angle plate, 30 degrees. It sticks to the guide bar magnetically. I look at the file from above so that I can maintain an optimal sharpening angle. Before I start filing, I have to stand in the right position. I'll do a lunge to make sure I'm standing straight. But before I start, I have to find my leading cutter. I have to find the shortest or the most worn down tooth. The best way to do that is by using a caliper gauge. I just check while I'm measuring. Okay, then I just look for it. Aha, this is shorter. I will put a little mark on it, and if I don't find a shorter tooth, then that will be my leading cutter. I have to be careful when filing, as I'm not wearing gloves, and I usually don't need to. There are two options. Either you wear gloves, or you only touch and work on the chain with the tools. If you pull the chain forward using a tool, then nothing can happen and you can't cut yourself. This is the tooth I marked, my leading cutter. It's the shortest tooth, and I will sharpen that one first. Okay. I'll do my lunge and stand up straight. I check whether I can easily move the file with my elbow and shoulder. Don't move your entire body, as then you'll be making a round body movement. Just your elbow and shoulder. Now I'm going to check the side plate angle. I'll hold my file against the chain and notice, oh, the angle is perfect, which means I don't need to put more pressure on the file. If you push the file downwards, the tooth will point forwards. If you pull the file upwards, the tooth will point backwards. Just file it as you think is best. When filing, I use the whole file, from top to bottom. When I pull the file back, I move the file away from the tooth. Otherwise, the shavings on the file would blunten what you just sharpened. File it as horizontally as possible, which is what the manufacturer also recommends. I keep track of how many file strokes I make. 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I'll check the damage on my leading cutter. It's been filed off. It's gone after just 6 file strokes. And now I'll measure the length of the tooth again. I'll use the caliper gauge to make sure that each tooth is the same length. I initially made 6 file strokes. I will do the same again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now I'll check if it's the right length. Not quite. I have to do at least 1 more file stroke. Good. It's fine. So now we move on to the next one. I will file every tooth so that it's the same length as the leading cutter. Once I've filed all the teeth on one side, I have to turn the chainsaw around and file the teeth on the other side. I'll do exactly the same on this side too. I made 7 file strokes, so I will make 7 here too. Okay, once I'm done with this side, then all of the teeth will have been optimally sharpened. So now it's time for the rakers. I will need a flat file and a depth gauge. I have a medium-sized saw here, and I want to cut relatively hard wood. So I need a depth gauge that creates a gap of 0.65 millimeters. Now, I know this depth gauge goes with this cutting tooth. I'll put my gauge on here and place my finger on the cutting tooth. I have 2 options now. I can file directly above the gauge. Everything above the gauge will be filed away. You need to know that this gauge isn't file-proof, so if I'm not careful and file the top part of the gauge, then it will become thinner and the gap length will no longer be correct. The second option would be to use the gauge to check how much needs to be filed off. Then simply file and check. It needs a bit more, so I'll do it again. Now it's perfect. Now I'll simply file down every raker as much as is needed. If you don't feel comfortable with freehand filing, there are certain aids you can use, like this file holder, for example. You can place the file holder on the cutting tooth and the raker. Check the file angle plate and file down the cutting tooth to the same height as the leading cutter, using the same amount of strokes. The advantage of this method is that the side plate angle is 100% correct, as the file holder prevents me from filing too much off. I'll still have to adjust my raker afterwards. This filing aid, the so-called 2-in-1 filing guide, has the following advantage. It has both a round file for the cutting tooth and a flat file for the raker, both in one tool. Okay, I will now place these metal rods on the front cutting tooth and the rear cutting tooth. I'll file in the direction indicated by my file angle plate and make the same amount of file strokes. So now, both the cutting tooth and the raker are automatically filed in one go. The tooth length is perfect. These are aids for those who don't feel confident enough yet. As you can see, it's not a great art form or a big deal. You need a sharp chain in order for you to enjoy your work. And as I said, there's not much to it.